2 classes left, including tonight, before we finish the Gita. We up and running? So, I think we're on 18, maybe 48, 49, something like that. Yeah, we're on 1850. The last verse that we looked at said, asakta buddhi, one whose intelligence is unattached. Asakta means unattached. And so their intelligence is unattached. Sarvatra, at all times, in all situations. Jitatma, they've conquered themselves. Means they've conquered their senses, they've conquered their passions. They've conquered themselves. Even like the word jaya that we say quite frequently. Jai is sort of an exclamation of happiness. It's kind of like hoorah or hooray or yay, orale, something like that. So even jai literally means victory. And so victory over oneself, conquering over oneself, jitatma. So somebody's conquered over themselves and their intelligence at all times unattached. Vigata spriha, and their passions are gone. Naishkarmya siddhim paramam sannyasena adhigacchati. So, sannyasena, by sannyas, by renunciation, adhigacchati, they'll get naishkarmya siddhim paramam, the supreme perfection beyond karma. Now this verse, there's sort of 2 ways you can take the section of the Gita that we're in. I think this is pretty remedial, but I think for you guys, you got to really pay attention right now. The previous section of the Gita that we just discussed says that you should worship the source of all things, of all beings, through your work. And Krishna gives you a sample of 4 types of careers somebody could have. And so you should not try to be something you're not. Be who you are, doing work which comes naturally to you, which is according to your innate nature. Now that could either support the caste system or go against it. If it's work that's according to your nature, that nature could be set according to the caste you're born into. Follow? Or you could say that's natural for you, irrespective of the caste you're born into. You should do what comes naturally to you and what feels right and what's according to your nature. You see the 2 ways you could interpret it? I don't think that's wrong. I think that the Gita works in a caste system, society. I think that the Gita works independently of the social structure of society. And so if you're dealing with a caste-based situation where people are largely following, the work of their forefathers, I think the Gita works in such a circumstance. I think the Gita works also in a circumstance where you're doing what comes naturally to you and not worrying so much about what your parents or your forefathers did. Do you guys follow that? So, the Gita says there's these 4 orders. The literal description is that they're according to your nature, not according to your birth. And we got a lot of support in our sacred literature that you should, that the guild system or the jati system or the varna system, more clearly, was based on one's natural inclination and not based on their birth. The whole Hare Krishna movement's based on that because we get Westerners and we make them into Brahmanas. And so we get people who by birth aren't Brahmanas, and we have them become Brahmanas. So our entire tradition is built on this. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was famous for saying, Kiba Vipra Kiba Nyasi, Shudra Kene Noi. Even a Brahmin, even a sannyasi, why not a Shudra? A Krishna Tapo Beti, She Guru Hoy. One who knows the truth about Krishna, their Guru. That person becomes Guru. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was famous for being non-caste conscious. Our whole movement is based on this. Acharya, the word acharya is a word which is used for the head of an institution, the head of an order. It's a very, very respectful title in Sanskrit. It literally means one who, behaves properly, therefore teaches by their behavior. But it's used practically exclusively for someone who's the head of a religious order, like a pope. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu named Haridas Thakur the Namacharya. Our practice, which is to chant the holy name, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu named as the Acharya of that holy name. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu named an ex-Muslim. Which, 500 years ago, it was like unheard of. Hindu and Muslim society today is stratified and separate. You'll have Muslim parts of town, you'll have Hindu parts of town. Sometimes when we're going on pilgrimage, we'll drive through a part of town, all of a sudden you see like animals being slaughtered on the street and butcher shops on the street, and it's like, oh, we're in the Muslim part of town. It's a whole different vibe. You feel like you're in a different country. And so most of India is Hindu, but every once in a while you come across the Muslim section of town, and then in that section of town it's just a whole different feel. What to speak of 500 years ago, how divided and separate the societies were. Mahaprabhu named Haridas Thakur the Namacharya. When Advaitacharya, super big Brahmana, super big part of our movement, when his father passed away, he did a Shraddha ceremony. The Shraddha ceremony is a funeral ceremony. One of the big parts of the ceremony is you call a big Brahmin to your house and you feed him. And that's like, gets blessings for your father. So Advaitacharya called Haridas Thakur to his house and fed him. Totally disturbed all the Brahmanas in the village because they thought it was an insult to them that none of them were chosen and this Muslim was chosen. So our movement is filled with this. Despite that, when the Hare Krishna movement was first starting, the only people to give initiation in the Hare Krishna movement were big Brahmins. Gopal Bhatta Goswami primarily was the big guru of like everybody who was initiating in Vrindavan. Rup Sanatan, the framers of our whole tradition, they didn't take any disciples through initiation, except maybe Jiva, and Jiva didn't take any disciples. They were Brahmins, but they lived with the Muslims, lived amongst the Muslims, so it was considered that they were contaminated. So they picked a South Indian Brahmana from a spotless heritage who converted to Krishna consciousness, to the Gaudiya Darshan, and he gave initiation, Gopal Bhatta Goswami. He is the founder of the Radha Raman temple that we go to see so often. Big Brahmin. Then, generation later, Narottam began initiating. Narottam was a Kayastha. It's kind of a half Kshatriya, half Shudra caste. Prabhupada was a Kayastha caste. They're clerks and government workers. They're technically Shudras, but they enjoy some of they'll be landed, which means they own land, and they'll have high government positions. And so that clerical office can be quite upwardly mobile. So Narottam was from that caste, definitely not qualified to take disciples. But he took disciples, and it created a whole stir amongst the Brahmanas that thought he shouldn't be allowed to take disciples. So you see the Hare Krishna movement where Chaitanya Mahaprabhu spoke against the caste system, But then in the immediate aftermath, we didn't want to rock the boat too much, and so we sort of followed the norm. And then as our movement gained momentum and gained steam and gained a following, then you saw some of the ideals of our movement being practiced. So similarly, thousands of years ago, Krishna spoke in such a way that it can be used to dismantle the caste system. At the same time, if people missed it, this idea of, doing your duty and not rocking the boat, and not thinking that you're going to have a material solution to a spiritual problem, not thinking that you're going to make a material solution to what's ultimately a spiritual problem, and accepting that the real problem of life is spiritual. Therefore, don't worry about the caste system. Just do your duty and cultivate Krishna consciousness. Or if the caste system gets ripped apart, don't worry about that. Just do your duty, work according to your nature, and practice Krishna consciousness. And so, the words of the Gita they're speaking a message of transcendence. And it's largely independent of the structure of society in which it exists. This is far out. You take a look at like Islam, which is essentially Sharia. Islam is a system of jurisprudence. It's a way to run society. The first day of the Islamic calendar is the day that Muhammad conquered Medina and established Sharia law and forced everyone in Medina to follow Sharia law. Dar al-Harb, a house of war, is a place where Islam is not the government, and they're not enforcing Sharia. Dar al-Salam, everybody can be a Hindu, but if there's a sultanate and if there's a caliphate and they have established Sharia law, then you're good. Then you're good. And it's considered Dar al-Salam, a house of peace. Turkey, the entire population of Turkey is, practically speaking, Muslim. There's a tiny Christian population. There's probably a few Jews hiding there, but mostly, 90+%, it's Muslim. And but at the same time, it's considered to be a hotbed for terrorist activity because it's a secular government. Whenever Islam goes somewhere, even by peace, like Indonesia has the largest Muslim population in the world because they just have so many people, like 500 million people. They're all Muslims. There's a small sort of, like Bali is like the Hindu refuge within Indonesia, but Indonesia itself is almost entirely Muslim. And so they have, Sharias gradually being instituted in Indonesia. It's extrajudicial. They're starting to establish Sharia courts and what have you. And so there was no war where Islam won Indonesia. It just was peacefully by trade. Muslim traders went there and people liked what they were saying, so they converted. But then eventually it becomes like, oh no, you have to institute Sharia. Because that's the Quran, is the institution of Sharia. Now that creates a problem because now your theology is really a theocracy, and you at some point have to take the government to fully bring in the golden age, and you got to enforce rules, and now your tradition is inexorably linked to the legal systems that were in vogue in the 700s. Did you guys follow this? Who's watching Nayaka? Okay. Do you guys follow that? In contrast, thousands of years prior, Krishna came up with a system which exists really independent of the social structure. That's powerful. It's not a small thing. The Jews had to get over this. You look at the Hebrew Bible, all those mitzvahs, so much of that stuff was law. They had to eventually get over that. And so, for a tradition to be able to exist in any social structure and to not be linked to a system of jurisprudence or a way of governing society, it's special. So the fact that Krishna's teachings would work in a caste-based society and would also work in a non-caste-based society where people did whatever they wanted to do or whatever they were born to do and not whatever family they were born into. It's powerful. It's something in Krishna's favor. So the last section we looked at said that do your duty. Every potential job you might have, a career you might have, isn't going to be perfect. Fire is covered by smoke, but there's still value in fire. Don't run around trying to create a better mousetrap and realize this whole rat race isn't going anywhere, and dedicate your life to transcendence. And in this way, your work in this world becomes a way of worshiping and connecting with God, because you're taking your God-given talent and you're giving them back. You got it? Now, this verse can either be seen as an extension of that. In other words, I'm working, but I'm asakta buddhi. My mind isn't attached, and I'm jitatma and vigata spriya. I'm self-controlled, and my desires are subdued and they're gone. And then I can achieve by sannyas. By that sannyas, I can achieve this perfect state beyond karma. Meaning, I'm in this world working, but in my heart I'm renounced. And therefore, the sannyas spoken of here is an internal state of existence which goes hand in hand with externally doing your duty. Did you guys follow that? Okay, I'm bewildered because I haven't even gotten into the serious stuff yet. I'm like, I just said ABC. I haven't even gotten into what would take a little bit of a mental challenge. I said stuff which should be obvious to anybody who's reading. So if you're not following, I'm left to conclude that you're seriously deficient or you weren't listening. Which one was it?
I was in the first half and I spaced out what you said at the end, so I know I missed something because I followed what you said.
Remember when I asked you guys to please listen?
Yeah.
I actually meant that. Because now I have to do it all over again.
I'm sorry.
Well, the way you can show you're sorry is by listening. Pretty simple. Are you guys listening?
Yeah.
I'm going to say it again. One way to read this verse, that by sannyas you can achieve a state beyond karma if you are detached, self-controlled, and your passions are gone. One way to read this is as a continuation of what Krishna just said. You're doing your duty externally in whatever social construct you're living in. But in your heart, you're no longer buying into the rat race. You're cultivating transcendence. And the sannyas spoken of here is meant to go along with the physical work that's described in the preceding verses. So the sannyas is a mindset, and that's meant to go along with the physical work which is in the preceding verses. Did you follow it that time? That's one way of reading it. And that's smooth, right? There's another way of reading it. The other way of reading is we're at the end of the Gita, and karma, jnana, and bhakti are three major themes in the Gita that come up repeatedly in the Gita. And Krishna is describing how the one who's following the path of karma might act. And now we're segueing into how one in the path of jnana might act. One of them is a path of action. The other one is a path of renunciation. Krishna has largely, even in this very chapter, spoken against renunciation. However, Krishna has not only spoken against renunciation. And every once in a while, he's talked about the person who's yoga arudha, who's risen in yoga, and therefore they can renounce this world. He's spoken of living in a silent, in a quiet place, separate from others, eating very little, and renouncing this world. And so there are a few places in the Gita where Krishna does speak neutrally. Talks about the person who's atma rati, who's self-satisfied, and how for them there's no duty, which indicates that they're beyond necessity of following karma. And so for the most part, Krishna has been pretty straightforward. Do your duty, be detached. The detachment is sannyas. The doing your duty is yoga. And those two things are meant to go together. Physically, in this world, you do your duty. In your heart, you're renounced. For the most part, Krishna has been consistent in beating that drum. Every once in a while, though, he's acknowledged that there might be some yogis, some sannyasis, some people who are able to renounce the world and kind of walk away from the world. And we get occasional verses in the 3rd chapter, in the 6th chapter, where he seems to view that at least in a neutral light or as a possibility. And we troubleshot those sections as we've gone through the Gita when they show up. So you either interpret what's coming next as the internal state of existence for one who is doing their duty, or alternatively, because we're in the 18th chapter of the Gita and Krishna's winding things up, he's going to do a treatment of karma, which happened when? It just happened. And now he's going to do a treatment of jnana. And what's a treatment of jnana? What's that mean? Renunciation, sannyas, yogi, living in the quiet, not eating much, celibacy, meditation, etc., etc. What we would traditionally think of with a yogi. You can actually read these two sections, the one we just did and the one we're going to do right now, in either way. If you want to see it holistically, then Krishna says, hey, do your duty, that's the way of worshiping God, and then in your heart become detached. And let me describe you what that detachment looks like. You follow? Alternatively, hey, for the person who's engaged in this world, here's what you should do. And for those rare souls who are ready to renounce the world, here's what they should do. Do you see the two ways of reading it? And the third way of reading it is, hey, as a result of doing the karma, you'll then eventually qualify yourself for jnana, for renouncing the world. And so you'll do your duty and get detached, and then you'll be able to renounce the world. Perhaps later on in life. After your children have been raised. As part of a retirement package that involves spirituality. Do you guys follow this? Okay, so Krishna talked about Naishkarmya Siddhim Param, the state of perfection beyond all karma, in the last verse. Adhigachati, that you'll go to. This verse starts with that idea of siddhi. Siddhi prapto, achieving that siddhi. Yata brahman tat apnoti nibodhame. Listen to me about how having achieved that siddhi, or achieving that siddhi, one can also achieve Brahman. One can also acquire Brahman. One can also become Brahman. One can also achieve Brahman. Do you follow this? For one who's achieved Siddha, the perfection I just spoke of, beyond karma, they can also achieve Brahman, Nibodhame. Listen to me as I speak about this. Samasena aiva kaunteya. I speak about it briefly. Nishtagyanasya yapara. About this highest state of jnana. See the word jnana there? See how the word jnana is there? And that supports the idea of reading it as a karma thing and then a jnana thing. You're naishkarmya, beyond karma, and now this is the highest type of jnana. It's a state of renunciation. See how the language supports dividing it into two sections? But the entire Gita supports reading it as one section. I think either one works. Did you follow it that time? You see how important it was that you followed and listened?
Yeah.
Did you guys see this? You guys should be looking at the books. You should have a book. There's no reason not to have a book. All right, now we're going to keep rolling with this, okay? Learn from me how one who has achieved this perfection can attain the supreme perfectional stage, Brahman, the stage of highest knowledge, by acting in the way I shall now summarize. They can find their own page, man. Just hand them the book. They're all grown up. Get back to class. So Prabhupada's saying, we went over the Sanskrit, so Prabhupada's translation is very clean. Learn from me how one who has achieved this perfection. What perfection? The perfectional stage beyond karma that I just mentioned. Can attain the supreme perfectional stage, Brahman, the stage of highest knowledge, by acting the way I shall now summarize. So this would support reading it as two separate paths or as two facets of the same path where you start off doing one thing and then do another thing. The problem with that reading where you start off doing one thing and then do another thing is what?
Why would you do the first thing? Because you could just do the second thing.
Okay, that's a small problem. Why would you do the first thing when you could just do the second thing? I don't know. You can't go to Spanish 2 until you take Spanish 1. So take Spanish 1 and then eventually take Spanish 2. Not a really good answer. I'm disturbed that you guys haven't followed this. What's the problem with reading this as two separate sections, or rather as one path with two facets, one where you do your duty and the other where you renounce the world? Makes one better than the other. Okay, fair enough. Sometimes it is better than, like sometimes one thing is better than the other. To be in the Olympics is better than playing at your junior college. So sometimes there are hierarchies in the Gita. So why is that? Why would that be a problem? Why would that be a problem? It wouldn't be. There's no problem. What?
Is it like trying to serve two masters?
I don't know what that means, but
Like trying to appease two things that...
no, it says do A, and then once you've done A successfully, then you can do B. How is that pleasing two masters? Did you follow that?
Yeah.
You got, listen, I don't mind doing this, but you guys got to think while you're talking to figure out if what you're saying is relevant. It's otherwise I'm forced to critique what you've said because you weren't capable of critiquing it yourself. What's the reason? By the way, I already told you what the reason was less than 5 minutes ago. Probably 4 times. At least 3. Go ahead.
My guess is that it's not clear when your qualification progresses.
No, I mean, that's true. Well, when's your qualification? When you've achieved a state beyond karma. Krishna's pretty explicit. When your intelligence is detached at all times, asakta buddhi, sarvatra, when you've conquered yourself, jitatma, when your desires are gone, vigata spriha, then at that time, you're able to adhigachati, go to a state which is naishkarmya siddhim paramam. It's pretty clear. The reason is because the entire Gita has been dedicated to the idea that you should never give up your duty, including this very chapter where Krishna critiqued sannyas and said he was into tyag, and he wasn't into sannyas. The entire Gita has continuously extolled the virtues of external action and internal renunciation. Yes or no?
Yes.
How could you miss this massive problem? The only way you could miss this is if you had not understood anything of the entire Gita. But we've been taught consistently through the entire Gita not to renounce the world, to always do your duty. There's been a couple of small, tiny sections where Krishna seems to acknowledge there might be another possibility. And to read this section as 2 separate paths or one path which becomes another path flies in the face of the majority of the teaching of the Gita. Yes or no?
Yes.
How big of a problem is that? How small is your problem compared to it? How big of a problem is this? How could you not know this?
Totally spaced out, not thinking about it.
It's a problem.
How does your problem stack up to this problem?
It's a very small problem compared to a larger problem.
You get it? How did you guys miss this? Do you remember now when I said the entire Gita has endorsed this, except for these couple of small verses that we've had to troubleshoot? But the Gita's been consistent, even in this very chapter. Do you remember me saying that? You see, I spoon-fed it to you guys. I gave you the answer. It's a huge, glaring problem. How do you resolve that glaring problem? You view it the initial way I said you view it. as externally you're doing your duty and internally you're renounced. In which case this section is just fine. However, it does seem like Krishna's doing two things at once. He's offering that reading and he's also endorsing another reading where at some point in your life you do become capable of a more full renunciation. I mean, I don't know. Would we expect all the grandfathers to be fighting in the Battle of Kurukshetra, like if they were old and decrepit? No, at some point you become capable of switching gears and moving into the autumn and the winter of your life. And so although Krishna's really strongly endorsed this idea of yoga as being the perfection of action and renunciation, there's still something to be said for when somebody gets to an age or a stage of development where renunciation becomes more natural or perhaps an option. Always internally done, and maybe sometimes externally done. If we read the verse this way, we then have Krishna summarizing both karma as well as Gyan in this 18th chapter as two major sections of the Gita. And the language does surely support this second reading as also being viable. Did you guys follow that? The first reading has a ton of support too. And so to appreciate this section, just like the preceding section where Krishna teaches something which can exist in a caste-based government as well as a non-caste-based government, similarly, appreciating this section in its entirety involves being able to appreciate two legitimate readings of the section. And rarely you get these things in the Gita where like two sections could be read in entirely different ways. Sometimes a verse could be read in a couple different ways. But to have an entire section of the Gita be able to be read in two separate ways, that is much more rare. And therefore it's a special feature of this section of the Gita, where these two sections, these two little, I don't know, what do you want to call them, like these two little I want to say niblets, but that's not really the right word. So these two little chunks, I guess is the word I wanted. These two chunks of the 18th chapter, like a dozen verses, can be read in two totally distinct ways where there's consistency. That's kind of cool. That shows some real skill when you can offer a double entendre, minus the sex, where you can really read something in two distinct ways and it's consistent. Do you guys follow that? And then it's up to you which way you find has more teeth. Okay? You guys with me now? Do you see why I asked you guys to pay attention? It's not the kind of thing where you guys can space out because I'm I'm teaching you two different ways to simultaneously read the verses we're looking at. You have to remember the verses we had last week and then add in the verses we had this week, and notice the joining verse that I mentioned and the specific type of language which is used and the flow. And if we miss that, then you guys aren't getting it. And it's one of these sections. I don't think it's particularly complicated, but you got to pay attention because there's a few moving parts. Does that make sense? Are you following this, Narayan? Yes. Okay. All right. Generally, I think if you guys tell me yes, you are. You know why? Because there's at least a 40% chance if I ask you if you're following and I think you're lying, that I'll ask you, explain it to me, in which case it then becomes a large discussion of why would you have lied to me and told me you understood when you didn't. And so I try to sort of like traumatize you guys by that, so that everybody's going to be straight with me. Because as annoying as it is to have you guys space out and not pay attention, at least it alerts me that we have a problem right off the bat, and I can troubleshoot it and fix it. Are you following this? Really? Let me just say it real fast. Krishna just got done explaining how you can work in this world but not be of it. And amazingly, Krishna's way of working would work in any social structure, which many religions wouldn't work. But Krishna's transcendent message can work in any social structure. For instance, a medieval Indian caste system, or the prior Indian system in the Golden Age, where caste was based on one's inclinations and not based on their birth. And in fact, we find the same thing in Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's own tradition, where sometimes we ebbed and flowed with society to not rock the boat too much, but at the same time to enact social reform. Similarly, this philosophical section of the Gita can be read as a continuation of where you're externally acting but internally renounced. But there's this other possibility that we've just mentioned a few times throughout the Gita. Krishna's brought up just a few times in a couple of verses, where you could actually look at the same section as outlining two different paths, or more properly, one path with two different facets. And there is a time for a true renunciation, as there is a time where you really renounce this world. That flies in the face of most of the Gita, but it's not that there's no verses which would support this. And it looks like there might be two distinct ways to read these sections and put them together. Either as do your duty, but internally remain renounced, and these verses are all about your internal state of being, or do your duty until you get renounced enough where you can externally manifest renunciation. Do you guys follow that? Buddhya vishuddhaya yukto. Yoked by pure intelligence. Now remember, before your intelligence was unattached. Now that same intelligence is being used for meditation. You'll see that in a second. Dritya atmanam niyamya cha. By a determined and regulated self. Shabdadin vishayang chakva, giving away all the sense objects. Raga dveshau vyudhasya cha, and also giving up rag and dvesh, attachment and aversion. Vivikta sevi, living alone. Laghu ashi, eating little. Yata vakaya manasa, with controlled mind, body, and speech. Dhyana yoga paro nityam, always devoted to the yoga of meditation, the highest yoga of meditation. Holding it as the highest object, always. Vairagyam sam upashritaha, and taking shelter of renunciation. Ahankara, bala, darpa, kama, krodha, parigraham, vimucha, being freed from ego, force, pride, lust, anger, possessiveness. Nirmama, you're free of possessiveness. Shanta, you're peaceful. Brahma Bhuyaya Kalpate. You are qualified to be Brahman. Remember how it said, I'll teach you how to achieve Brahman? These things qualify you to be Brahman. Brahma Bhuyaya, for being Brahman. Kalpate, you are qualified. You are able to be Brahman. So the verse says, after you've achieved Siddhi, from the last section, by doing your duty as worship of God, from whom everything comes, then with having achieved that Siddhi, you can now achieve Brahman. And these verses tell you how to achieve Brahman. Do you guys follow that? Prabhupada joins all three verses together because they finish with this idea of achieving Brahman that was introduced in in text 50. And then these three verses tell you how to achieve Brahman. You guys following this? Now, does that sound like you've renounced the world and you're living in a cave? It does. And that's why the other reading is important to have. Could you twist these verses and say you're like doing your duty, but like this is all like an internal thing? You could. It's not impossible. The Vivikta Sevi, living by yourself, is a rough one. But you could say in your heart, you're like detached. Eating little, you could say you're not eating for sense gratification. You're eating to keep body and soul together. But these verses do tend to favor a pure Gyan path, which Krishna just got done criticizing at the beginning of this chapter and throughout the entire Gita. Did you follow that? And it shows a real connection between the two paths. So normally it's like internally you're renounced, but externally you're acting. This is a little different. This is externally do your duty until you achieve a stage of purity whereby you can engage in really intense meditation. It still shows some connection, but now it's an evolution as opposed to an internal state of detachment combined with an external state of action. Now this is an external state of action with detachment until such time as you become purified and old enough to just engage in more of a full stage of renunciation. Do you guys follow that? You could say theoretically that, and these people would still perform yagya, dan, and tapa, sacrifice, charity, and austerities. And therefore they're in tandem with the way Tyag was described, that one should never give these up because they purify even the great souls. So even a great soul who's renouncing the rest of his duties would still engage in some duties. Did you guys follow that? And it wouldn't be a full renunciation. It would be a renunciation of most things, but still you would be attached to doing your duty in terms of yagya, dan, and tapa, in terms of sacrifice, charity, and penance. Did you guys follow that? So there's ways to do it, but just reading this as purely an internal state of existence doesn't really work. And it also would indicate that at some point Arjuna wouldn't be riding out into the battle. Do you guys follow that? And now you've become Brahman. Okay? You've become Brahman. Remember that. It's important. Brahma Bhuta. Having become Brahman is how the next verse starts. Last verse starts, you're qualified to be Brahman. This verse says, having become Brahman. Prasanatma. You are a completely peaceful soul. Prasanna is the same. Prasanna is the same as sad. Prasad, same word, sad. Prasanna means completely tranquil. Na shochati. You are not lamenting. Na kankshati. You are not hankering. Samasarveshu bhuteshu. You are equal to all beings. This is the fruit of Gyan. The fruit of karma, right, is that you achieve a state beyond karma. You follow? Once you've done that, you become qualified for Gyan, the highest gyan, Jnanasya para. In that highest stage of gyan, you do all this renunciation. Vivikta sevi, living apart from people, eating very little, always being devout to your meditation, taking shelter of renunciation, being totally non-possessive, giving up lust, anger, and greed, etc., etc., etc. And then finally, Brahma Bhuyaya Kalpate, you are qualified to become Brahman. And then, just like the last verse said, you achieve Siddhi. And then the next verse says, having achieved Siddhi, you now become qualified for Brahman. This verse begins with having become qualified for Brahman and being totally tranquil, not hankering or lamenting. Samasarveshu bhuteshu, you're equal to all beings. Mad bhaktim labate param. That person gets supreme bhakti. Let's read Prabhupada's translation of the last verses. Being purified by his intelligence, controlling the mind with determination, giving up the objects of sense gratification, being free from attachment and hatred, one who lives in a secluded place, who eats little, who controls his body, mind, and power of speech, who is always in trance, and who is detached, free from false ego, false strength, false pride, lust, anger, and acceptance of material things, free from false proprietorship, and peaceful. Such a person is certainly elevated to the position of self-realization. Okay? One who is thus translated situated at once realizes the Supreme Brahman and becomes fully joyful. Prabhupada here is saying fully joyful for prasana. I said fully tranquil. Maybe I got it wrong. I have to look up prasana real quick. Give me a second. Lucky I got my handy dandy dictionary in front of me. Clear, bright, pure, true, right, plain, correct, placid, tranquil, soothed, pleased, gracious, kind, kindly disposed, favorable, gracious, showing favor. Let's take a look at this. Give me a second here. Row 3. Prasanna. Yeah, it's from prasad. Same thing. Clear, bright, pure, distinct, perspicuous. I think that means seeing things. Like perceptive. True, right, plain, correct, just, soothed, pleased, gracious, kind, kindly disposed, favorable, pleasing. Anyway, so I think I was giving a more literal translation. And Prabhupada, he gave a slightly different translation. He becomes fully joyful. He never laments or desires to have anything. Obviously, I'm not critiquing Prabhupada's translation. Favorable is also a secondary meaning. And so, to defend Prabhupada's translation, if you're equal towards all living beings, if you're not hankering or lamenting, it means you become tranquil. And so then Prabhupada's taking maybe a secondary meaning of prasanna, of joyful. Or it could be that in common day usage, prasanna, I don't know how prasanna is used nowadays, in Hindi or something like that. It could mean that it means joyful. But one of the secondary meanings was favorable. And so Prabhupada was obviously going with that and running with that. Perhaps one of our acharyas, one of our teachers, said that prasanna means joyful in one of their commentaries. So Prabhupada ran with that. He becomes fully joyful. He never hankers or laments. He's equally disposed towards every living entity. In that state, he achieved pure devotional service to me. Now, what's special about this verse? If you guys followed, every single one of you should understand something special and magical about this verse. Yeah.
It's describing bhakti as the activities that happen after liberation from material entanglement.
Sure. Good. I would say the same thing a little differently. I would say that if we do have a karma and jnana, with jnana above karma, we have bhakti above both of them. And every path picks up where the last one left off. And now we find the perfection of jnana, of sannyas, of renunciation is supreme bhakti to Krishna. Therefore, it maintains the hierarchy that we've heard throughout the Gita. And so even if there is some sense in which it's talking about karma leading to jnana, flying in the face of so much of Krishna's instruction, it still does preserve the hierarchy with bhakti at the top. That also fully further supports reading it as 3 different sections or 3 different stages of the same basic path, because now we have the stage of bhakti. And we see this language where each one starts off where the last one left off. Siddhi leads to Brahman, Brahman leads to bhakti. Did you guys follow that? You left for quite some time, so I'm not expecting you to follow. Did you guys follow that? Isn't that far out? It's far out, right? I think that's more or less what you were saying, but I would frame it like that, and I think you can see where I'm trying to go with this. Does that make sense? So, we got 2 ways to read this. One way is Krishna has told you, hey, do your duty, be internally detached. And we're like, yeah, Krishna's been saying that all along. Makes sense he'd say it at the 18th chapter. He's wrapping it all up. Oh, wow, he even threw in the caste system, which amazingly seems like it's not birth-based, but it could be birth-based in a culture, and Krishna wouldn't be too stressed about it because his thing is about transcendence and not trying to build a better mousetrap. You know, one of my students, Amrita Garangi, she posted a picture on Instagram today of this beautiful sunrise. And she said, you know, we just have to learn how to learn our lessons and not hold on. And we have to let go of one stage of life to get to the next one. And, you know, and that there's times for everything and that there's lessons to be learned at every time. Did you guys follow that? And so I wrote back and said, hey, that's really nice. That's really good. But then I also offered something else, which is that the purpose of life is to go beyond such ephemeral lessons and pivotings and to find the real amidst the temporary and the permanent amidst the temporary and the true amidst the false. And not just to learn lessons from these all too ephemeral moments and be present in the moment and be able to learn whatever life's throwing at you in the moment, but also to cultivate, side by side with that, some real healthy transcendence where you go beyond this world. Krishna has nothing to do with, the material life. But you're in the material body, so he's giving you a way that you can use your material body and your material proclivities and use it in a way that's favorable for your spiritual life. So you have to run away from the world. It's not like this world becomes an accident. For, dualistic Christians, it's like this world is mammon, it's of the devil, there's nothing in it. It's of value. It's completely distinct from God. It tears you away from God. You just got to get martyred as quickly as possible and die so you can go back to heaven, because this whole world is one big temptation. You follow? We don't have that. We have, whether based on the family you're born into or based on your natural proclivity, do your duty. Don't think you're going to solve the problem of this world materially. It's an inside job. Cultivate detachment. Do your duty. That's how you rise above it all. And then once you've done that, you go beyond karma. And that internal state of detachment, let me describe that to you. And that internal state of detachment eventually leads you to love and bhakti. And so we have jnana is your mentality, karma is your activity, and bhakti is what a detached mentality ultimately leads to, because you're detaching from this world and you're attaching to the person from whom everything comes, and that's the bhakti. And Krishna's just explained to us what he's been telling us the entire Gita, which is do our duty, be detached, and eventually that leads to devotion. Alternatively, do your duty until you achieve a stage beyond duty, in which case you'll give up your duty and start to live like a full-blown yogi. And then when you get to the perfection of that, you'll become a bhakta. Either one works. The second one finds a lot of support. Not from the whole Gita, but from this section. And there's enough support in the Gita that it's okay. And both readings work. Both readings have value. Did you guys follow that? Now the liberalness of bhakti is described. Regardless of how you took those preceding sections, now the liberalness of bhakti is described. Well, first bhakti is described. By bhakti, right? You achieve bhakti, and by that bhakti. So each thing leads to the next. Did you follow that? Siddhi leads to Brahman. Brahman leads to bhakti. And now by that bhakti, Mama Bijanati, one can know me. Yavanyas chasmi tapata, as much as I exist in truth. Tato mam tapato yava, and having known me in truth, Vishase tadanantaram. One can enter into that eternality. So by bhakti, one approaches God, one goes to heaven, one transcends this world altogether. Okay? Sarva karmani, one can understand me as I am, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, only by devotional service, and one's in full consciousness of me, by such devotion, he can enter the kingdom of God. There you go. Right? So now the liberalness of bhakti is described. What bhakti results in, going to the spiritual world, is described. The fruit of bhakti is described. And now that whole karma jnana bhakti thing is done. But now the liberalness of bhakti is described. Sarva karmani api sada kurvano mad vyapashraya. Taking shelter of me while doing all duties. Mad prasada avapnoti shashvatam padam avyayam. By my grace, you will achieve the supreme eternal abode. So now there's no requirement for like this long renunciation. You just do whatever you're doing, but take shelter of Krishna, and tat prasadat, by my prasad, by my grace, you will transcend. It's actually funny, but the word prasad, primarily in Sanskrit, also means tranquil. Like Prabhupada translated prasanna as joyful, but it primarily means tranquil. Prasad also primarily means tranquil, but Krishna says mat prasada, by my prasad, in which case 100% you have to take the secondary meaning, by my grace. You follow? So there's kind of multiple meanings you can take, and you got to fit the right one in for the verse. It's a further defense of sometimes going with a secondary definition when contextually it makes sense and helps and doesn't become unnecessarily redundant. You take that secondary meaning and it keeps the verse alive. Did you guys follow that? It's a little troubleshooting. I don't want to ever say I gave the more literal translation Srila Prabhupada did. So I was unsure of myself. I looked it up, and when I looked it up, it seemed like my understanding was correct. So then I'm now defending Prabhupada by pointing out how with the same verbal root, he gave another secondary definition. But here it's undeniable. You have to go with this definition. And to create a non-redundancy in the previous section, he also went with a secondary definition. Now this is totally different than previously. It was like you got to live in a quiet place, you got to eat very little, you got to conquer your mind, conquer your senses, achieve this, achieve that. And then bhakti, the liberalness of bhakti is described. Just do whatever you do and take shelter of me. By my grace it'll all work out and you'll achieve perfection. The goal of the last verse, you'll achieve it by my grace. Do you see the liberalness of this idea? Because bhakti is not based on what you do or what you know, it's based on who you know. It's based on an intimate relationship with Krishna where he bequeaths to you transcendence. And then he troubleshoots, what if I don't do this? He's going to get into that in a second. We'll do that next week. Okay. Did you guys follow all that? Thank you guys on Instagram very much. Thank you guys on Facebook equally as much. Good night. Let's go fast. What do you guys reckon? Yeah.
So